Hi there. So, welcome to my class on how to pick a strain of oyster mushrooms. And this is not only about a strain, how to pick, but also about some other things that you should know when you want to purchase your spawn, for example, or when you want to grow those oyster mushrooms, on how to apply some kind of strategic things in order to get better yields. Let me introduce you some of the commonly grown oyster mushroom species and varieties. Just want to show you the differences between the various commercially grown oyster mushrooms. So let's start with the common oyster mushroom that includes different colors of mushrooms actually. White, olive, blue, gray or brown with some slight differences between them, like cap shape or substrate preference. Also, oyster mushrooms don't really have stable colors because they usually change from darker to light during fruit body development. This is the phoenix oyster, an elegant mushroom with spongy thick stalk and rather fragile and lopped caps. It belongs to the so-called Pleurotus ostreatus complex, which is a complex of species, varieties, or forms put together in a group just because they don't have reliable characters for taxonomists to distinguish between them. Many of these characters overlap and therefore they couldn't delimit them into distinct species. Okay, so let's get back to our phoenix oyster. This is a mid-weather mushroom that grows on both hardwoods and conifers. This is one of the few oyster mushrooms that grows on conifers. It has a typical white mycelium with a strong pungent smell and delivers up to 3 flushes. This is the common oyster mushroom with a bluish-gray color somewhat similar to the variety columbinus, which is usually dark blue to gray and also grows on conifers. The typical common oyster prefers cold temps. They have a white mycelium with a characteristic smell and grow on hardwood. Here's another member of the group with a beautiful pearl color. That's why this oyster mushroom it's called a pearl oyster. Resembles very much Pleurotus cornucopiae, but here I believe that the indoor grow room conditions shaped this mushroom and made it look like a cornucopia variety. This is an interesting member of the Ostratus complex that is white or dirty white in color and is different because prefers hot weather. It originates from Florida and therefore was called by growers Pleurotus florida, or the Florida oyster mushroom. In the Latin nomenclature, Pleurotus florida doesn't exist, but even like this, it's still used even today. This oyster mushroom is another member of the complex and has a light brown color, but as you may see here, when it starts to flush, the pinheads are blue. So see, this is the thing with oyster mushrooms. You cannot really rely on their color, because in the morning they're dark in color and by the evening they're just lighter in color, so the color changes all the time. The yellow oyster is an elegant and delicate oyster mushroom. Taxonomically, it is close to Pleurotus cornucopiae. This means that it may be confused with it because it looks pretty much the same. This one prefers warm temps, has a special somewhat peppery flavor, and a delicate flesh, grows on hardwoods and will give you only 2 flushes. The mycelium is at first white, then turns cream or light yellowish. I really recommend you to try growing this one. Also, there are some cold loving strains out too. Make sure to ask when you want to purchase this mushroom. This mushroom also has a poor shelf life and therefore is rather sold locally. So big attention with that, because once you place it on the shelf, it might turn really bad after even a day or so. Another warm temp oyster is this beautiful pink oyster. This particular one belongs to the jamor complex, and it's called a salmon oyster mushroom because of its wonderful salmon-like color that ranges in intensity depending on the strain and environmental conditions, of course. So this mushroom usually fruits before full spawn run of the substrate. So first it fruits, then fully colonizes the substrate. Unfortunately, it's not as tasty as the other kinds discussed above, but the fruit bodies are rather soft to somewhat firm or even rubbery, but if you'll pick them while young, it's going to be a different experience. Also, I wanted to tell you that the fruit bodies of this mushroom dry up fast, and in some cases you may notice changes in color. Finally, we enter into the real kingdom of the oyster mushrooms, and I have the honor to introduce you the king oyster mushroom. This is said to be the best oyster when you think of flavor, because some varieties of the Eringi complex are simply amazing. I personally tasted the Ferrule variety, and I simply think that is the best oyster mushroom that I ever ate. The advantage of growing king oysters is that the whole fruit body is edible compared to the other oyster mushrooms mentioned here. The other oyster mushrooms, they have stalks that are not edible, but they are rather woody, and especially when mature, they are not really edible. If you're going to check their stalks while they're young, you might even eat those, but still, it's not the same as what you can find in the king oysters. Another advantage is the spore count. The king oyster seems to have less spores compared to the other oyster mushroom kinds. And therefore this means that the one who grows this mushroom might be less affected. And I don't really want to get into that. I mean, to tell you what means to be affected by spores. It's it simply gets you sick. You feel like you would have a flu or something. This is a cold-loving mushroom. It has a meaty flesh with a nutty flavor and will give you up to 3 flushes. Generally, you'll get 2. If you'll get my other course on how to grow this particular mushroom, you'll get at least 3. This mushroom also has an excellent shelf life compared to the other kinds. Pleurotus nebrodensis belongs to the king oyster group and resembles most of the characteristics discussed above. But compared to the other one, growing this one is going to take you a lot of time. This one has a great shelf life though. The abalone oyster is one of the interesting oysters, first because its mycelium has these black strange liquid dots all over it. The untrained eye might think that it's a black mold infection, but it's not. The caps are up to 5 centimeters wide and the stem is rather short. It prefers warm weather and will give you 2 flushes. Now that you've met the kids, let's see what kinds you could grow in your location.